Welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kaligan, and we are here with another Q&A, answering your questions. Our favorite people in the world, the World War Now Aether Hour supporters. You people who not only get access to all of our Aether Hour backlog content and each new weekly subscriber-exclusive episode, of course, but you also get the chance to ask us questions in our monthly Q&A thread. So if you want to join the fun and ask questions, become part of the episodes, and help us with the content, be sure to get behind the paywall on worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. So with all of that, without further ado, Dimitri, how are you doing? I think our first question here is from John Mullins, if you want to cue it up.
Sure, I'm doing great and looking forward to the episode. So, John Mullins, your question. If you guys were ever tonsured as monks, what saint, and if you could choose, would you want to be named after? If you could be a monk at any monastery in the world, where would you want to choose and why?
Well, that's a really good question, John. John, of course, a good friend of the show, helps us a lot on some things behind the scenes, so be sure to show him some love if you ever see any clips or anything we're doing. But it's a good question, of course. A little bit hard to answer because, of course, in a situation where you are a monastic, the ability to choose things goes away very quickly. But insofar as there's always sort of this lingering thought behind any Orthodox person's mind that, maybe if I die or maybe when I'm old or something like this, maybe I'll live at a monastery or something like that. And I don't know, it's a tough question. Of course, Mount Athos is always calling. It's very beautiful there. I believe Caracalou, as a lover of Elder Ephraim, maybe if I visit Mount Athos, I'll probably want to visit Caracalou and some of the ones that Elder Ephraim helped reestablish, as well as St. Panteleimon and Hilander, the Russian and Serbian monasteries on Mount Athos. But for someone in America, frankly, I mean, there's obviously Platina, which a lot of people say, which is, when I was first becoming Orthodox, that's definitely what I would have said, of course. Father Seraphim Rose is near and dear to my heart, but I mean, the monastery near me, Holy Archangels, is wonderful. I believe all of Elder Ephraim's are beautiful. I've heard amazing things about St. Nectarios in New York and some others. There's a Russian Orthodox monastery in Michigan. I can't believe I'm forgetting its name, but I think it's one of the most beautiful as well. And of course, we love Abbot Trifon at Vashon Island, at All Merciful Savior. That's one of the most beautiful places in all of the world, let alone to have a monastery. But as far as my name, I don't know. I chose St. Conrad as my patron saint. It would be maybe interesting to keep that if I somehow became a monk, but that's not usually what happens. There are a lot of saints, of course. It would be cool to be named after St. Joseph the Hesychast, like many of Elder Ephraim's spiritual children are and whatnot, as he is, the grandfather, the saint, the canonized saint who is kind of overseeing now all of the monasteries. Of course, Elder Ephraim will be canonized soon, so perhaps later on, if I became a monk, it would be cool to be named after him, because we know Metropolitan Neophytos, relaying the words of Eldris Galactia, he said, Elder Ephraim is the greatest saint of the 20th century. Apparently, some people are saying this. So to have him be so near and dear to America and have done so much work here is amazing. So probably somewhere in that vein, I would say, in his legacy. Although of course it's a very hard question to answer. But Dimitri, what about you?
Oh, I think, I did do some thinking about this particular question, but there is no doubt I would, at the moment, at least my fascination with the Saint Andronicus of Perm and Andronik Nikolsky, so he was a Russian bishop and, of course, a monastic. I would definitely, if I had a choice, would take his name. Saint Andronicus was martyred by the Bolsheviks, but prior to the Russian Revolution, he was, of course, a missionary in a lot of places in the Perm region, in Yaroslavl, his initial diocese, and again in Japan as well, in Kyoto. So he's done basically, not only did he live as a monastic, but also he lived during the Russian Revolution, supported the Tsar, was a very fiery monarchist. In fact, his nickname was the Burning Flame. If you're a bishop and a monk and your nickname is the Burning Flame, and that's because you give such fiery sermons and you actually stick to the truth and protect the church, protect your flock. I think if I had a chance to be a monastic and maybe a clergyman as well, in combination would definitely be Saint Andronicus would be the choice. Although, of course, Saint Andronicus, right, the name A and like my name personally, they don't necessarily align. So, but nevertheless, Saint Andronicus's name when he was still in the world was Vladimir. So from V to A, it's not really a smooth transition either. But Saint Andronicus, without a doubt. So and he was only 47 when he was martyred too, so he was quite young. He became a monk at 25, so quite an interesting life journey. A very important saint in my life, super inspirational. So that's who I would choose if I had a choice. I've always felt a closeness to perhaps a region like the Altai Mountains, just reading about them. I would probably choose a more colder place. So maybe the St. Dimitri men's monastery in the Altai, like near the mountains where it's cold, um, peaceful, quiet, sort of away from any big cities. I think that's pretty important for monastic life. And of course, maybe a monastery that isn't too big, which doesn't have like a set bureaucracy, so I can at least feel that my labor can go towards something new and perhaps prosperous. And that seems like probably the place I would go as a monastic.
Yeah, as far as other saints, of course, I almost thought about choosing St. John Chrysostom as well as Seraphim of Sarov when I was becoming Orthodox. So perhaps John, Seraphim, Joseph, Ephraim. I guess those are the names I might be choosing from. But that was a great answer, Dimitri. Thank you for the question, John. We're going to move on to a question from Peter C., who asks, are there any figures that you are aware of who you would like to see emerge in leadership positions in a future Russian-controlled Kharkov, Odessa, or other oblast along the lines of Stremousov while he was alive, for instance? For those who don't know, Stremousov, he was the deputy head of the Kherson region before he was unceremoniously taken out just weeks after going on a based, rant naming them and protesting against the Russian withdrawal from Kherson, which they did, and Kherson is still under Ukrainian control to this day. So it's dangerous out there on the front lines to be a true patriot sometimes. And of course, we don't know too much about the behind the scenes plans to have any of these people be in charge or what the plans for Odessa are if there is an operation on that city from the sea and on the whole oblast. But for Kharkov, we have a little bit more of a picture because there is a military civilian administration and they do have a few villages, on the border with Luhansk that Kharkov has that are controlled by the Russians still, despite, the retreats that happened a while ago now. But there is Vitaly Konstantinovich Ganchev, who is the head of the Russian occupation of Kharkov, and he seems to be a true patriot. So, Dmitry, I don't know if you have any more details about him, but besides that, there isn't too much info about who exactly is going to be, or even is likely to come to power in some of these places.
Yeah, Vitaly Ganchev is a really good example of somebody who was from like a local one of these areas, which are at the moment still occupied by Ukraine. But he was sort of a native-born Russian Ukrainian. He worked in the immigration department, so a public servant. Then he became a police officer, rose up to the rank of a colonel. And when, of course, the Maidan occurred, he joined the Lugansk People's Republic militia as in the rank of a colonel as well. So he had some, firearms experience, leadership experience, and he, of course, rose up in those ranks. What we know about the Lugansk People's Republic militia is they were the most, shall we say, right-wing and based. You can say, anti-Semitic perhaps. So they were the most sort of powerful group of individuals that had really good leadership. Of course, in people like Batman, the famous leader of the Lugansk People's Republic, as well as Mozgovoy, who was assassinated as well. His diary is a really good read if you can obtain it, even in Russian, just translate it to English. But Ganshev is a good example of someone who was there at the beginning for the last 10 years. And there's really not that many people like him because, again, the Odessa Oblast was occupied by like the most hardcore Banderite, you can say, pagan neo-Nazis you can imagine. So a good example is General Maxim Marchenko, is a Ukrainian Aidar battalion leader who was actually installed by Zelensky in the first months of the war in 2022 as the governor of Odessa Oblast. So Zelensky took this Aidar battalion Banderite general, installed him as the governor of Odessa Oblast. Can you imagine the purges that this guy undertook between, whilst in office between 22 and March of 2023? It must have been like an insane year. So there's probably not that many actual fiery patriots left in Odessa and even in the Oblast. And if there are any, you won't hear about them, neither will we, because it would only be local knowledge. If these guys ever posted anything on Telegram, they would have their house raided or they would just be assassinated. So maybe some people will emerge, from the actual people. I'm sure there are some strong patriots still hiding underground, things like that, but we won't hear about them. And probably for their own safety, it's best for them not to kind of stick their heads up at the moment. Same thing in Kharkov, because Kharkov, again, not occupied by Aidar, but they were occupied by the right sector group, which again is just, probably the most Banderite sort of extremist group you can imagine, and they're occupying Kharkov, purging it at the moment. But Kharkov being a lot close to Belgorod and a lot close to Russia, probably there's a lot more overlap over there in terms of who exactly can come into the administration. Even the people like Andrei Alexeyenko, Conrad, you'll notice they're more like career politicians and businessmen who kind of transitioned into the public service in Russia. So those people, I prefer more if there were people with a bit more experience in the military to take up leadership positions, only because there's a higher chance they won't be as corrupt, and probably they'll have some, martial reputation behind them. It'll be more like a Roman imperial type governance system in these new oblasts. I think that would be for the better.
Yeah, I completely agree. Anybody that's more connected to the original Donbas patriots, Moscovoy, obviously Givi, Motorola, these types, those are going to be the people that we would rather see in power. They would have a more civilizational understanding of this conflict. Of course, we know Strelkov is still in prison, but we know that he's one of the few people that is so close to this conflict that fully extrapolates effectively the World War Now epistemological perspective on geopolitics and how it relates to the Ukraine conflict, and of course the inevitable drift towards conflict with Turkey, and the prophesied World War III that we talk so much about here. But I think you gave a good response there. I think Gonchev, we're going to be watching him closely, see if anything comes, and Peter, if we see anybody else coming up the ranks in Kherson or in Odessa or Nikolaev or Sumy or these places, we'll be sure to post about them on the social media. So follow us on the Telegram. That'll probably be where we post about that first if we hear anything. But moving on to a question from Jeff Moore, good fan of the show. He asks, can you break down some of the lesser-known schisms in the Orthodox Church? Most people are aware of the EP/Moscow and the Ukraine issue, but Wikipedia lists 19 uncanonical bodies. Roughly how many of these are CAA and which ones are just someone going rogue? Well, most of those schisms aren't really the exact same as the EP Moscow schism, because Moscow and the EP are all in communion with basically all of the other Orthodox churches, so in a way are still in some form of communion with each other, as opposed to some of these other groups like Old Calendarists or these Rokor schismatic groups, which are obviously a bit different. Obviously, there's of course the non-Chalcedonian schism, which less people know about than of course the Great Schism, but everybody's aware of Copts and Ethiopians and whatnot. This is a schism that some people would like to think is maybe in the midst of healing or is somehow not really real. Of course, it is very real. We hope that perhaps the Malankara will become Orthodox and accept Chalcedon at the behest of the Russians, but there's that issue. Besides that, of course, we've talked about in the past, there's Rokor, there's Rokor A, there's the true Orthodox schismatics from Rokor, there's the Holy Orthodox Church of North America, there's all of these groups. I think some of the biggest lists are among the Greek Old Calendarists, though of course there's the initial Florinite versus Matthewite schism with, the majority of the Old Calendarists, the Florinites not wanting to be as harsh on the New Calendar Greek Church as the Matthewites, who were hardcore, schismatic in spirit and did a lot of really terrible things as well, although both were still schismatic. But once the Matthewites kind of passed on and everything, the Florinites, they had a lot of schisms in and of themselves. That's how these groups always go. There's always schisms within schisms. There's, the genuine Orthodox Church of Greece, the Auxentios Synod, the Synod in Resistance, the Macarian Synod, and then even the Matthewites that are still around have other schismatic bodies. There are, of course, the Old Calendarists in Romania, that I believe there's about 1 million of them. I don't think, have actually schismed as much within their ranks. So I think Romania actually has the largest united Old Calendarist body, even though I believe Greece probably has the highest number of, Old Calendarist schismatics of any country. But as far as other schisms, there's technically there's the recently resolved schism between Antioch and Jerusalem, which went on for, 9, 10, 11 years or so, but over the territorial jurisdiction of Qatar, and how, it's supposed to be under Antioch, but Jerusalem sent a hieromonk there, and there's really only 1 or 2 priests there to begin with, so it caused a whole issue. But in the midst of October 7th and the Gaza crisis and, the Zionist genocide, they managed to mend that schism and to move forward and restore, canonical communion. So that's no longer happening. But I don't know, it's never too good to focus too much on these schismatic groups. Obviously, we pray for their return, and there are certain Old Calendarist groups in Greece that at times maintained communion with Rokor, so perhaps we can hope that they would return to the church sooner rather than later. But it's most important just to pray for unity and that these people would come back into the fold. But I don't know your thoughts, Dimitri.
Yeah, my thoughts are the same. Of course, schisms can only be healed through humility and repentance, really. You can't, like, the pride cannot destroy a schism, it seems. But of course, the more based we as Orthodox Christians become, the more sort of pious and virtuous, and the more we pray, the more these schismatics will sort of see the true sort of orthodoxy within us, and the fact they've fallen away from grace, and perhaps they will return on their own accord. But some of the big schisms, I guess, well, not really big. All of these schisms are quite small. After 1054, I would consider mentioning the Rokor schism of course, the Masonville schism, which is very, very small. It's again dwindled since the early 2000s. Then, of course, the recent Rokor schism in 2007, 2008, which again operates in different countries of the Western world, Canada, the US, Australia, and it's just a big question of whether or not these schismatics actually interact with one another. There's two really lesser known schisms in the Georgian Orthodox Church, actually, and that's the Pitsunda and Sukhumi dioceses of the Abkhazian Orthodox Church. So these two dioceses are schismatics in Abkhazia. There's also the separate Abkhazian schism, the Holy Metropolis of Abkhazia, which these two Abkhazian churches, since of course Abkhazia has become an oblast of the Russian Federation, they've kind of chosen to, again, separate themselves from the Georgian Church. Just a bit of a confusing situation there. But again, these are very, very small and schisms, and they're very much related to local nationalisms and perhaps tribalisms, even trying to, maybe separatist tendencies, similar to the Ukrainian schisms, which there are essentially two of at the moment: the Philaret Patriarch of Kiev schism, and of course the Epiphany Ecumenical Patriarchate supported schism. Yeah, there's the Montenegrin Orthodox Church schism, which again, there's nothing Orthodox about it, quite degenerate. Then the Alternative Synod of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, which is just a complete political fiction created in 1992 when the official Bulgarian Orthodox Church, kind of agreed with the DQ, agreed to support the new non-communist government. This church was essentially saying that, well, look, I think the church is still occupied by the Bulgarian KGB, etc. So they schismed away. There's small, of course, old calendar schisms, all, as Conrad said, all across Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Greece. These four countries are just littered with small schismatic churches and groups. And there are also, of course, two Rokor schisms which operate within Russia and Ukraine itself. We spoke about Rokar, so that's Russian Orthodox Church, the autonomous church, so-called. They have literally communities within the Russian Federation at home. I suppose they had some pretty notable churches which even had relics. For example, the relics of Saint Yevrosynia of Suzdal. She was a princess, the sister-in-law of Alexander Nevsky, so quite an old saint, 800 years old. Her relics was actually in the possession of the Russian Orthodox Autonomous Church for quite a while, in the oblast of Suzdal, near the city itself, and only in 2015 were those relics somehow coordinated and working together with the local authorities. They kind of determined that these relics perhaps belong in the city's main cathedral rather than in the possession of this little schismatic cult. And there are, of course, the Rokor schism of Agafangel, which operates in Odessa. So Odessa is the home base. So, when the Russians do take Odessa, there'll be some questions as to exactly the legitimacy of this particular Rokor schismatic group operating out of Odessa. And this is belonging to, of course, former Bishop Agafangel and his subordinates. We know in Kazakhstan they had some recent real estate issues because they had Rokor possessions in Kazakhstan belonging to the schismatic group, and they were recently, there was some legal disputes. So schismatic groups, of course, litter the church, sort of the former church grounds, shall we say. But this is quite normal. We see people fall away through different sins. One of those sins, of course, is pride and just this feeling of trying to be exclusive and, of course, insubordinate to your leaders, even if your leaders are, let's just say, not the best of people. So it's just something that happens throughout church history and has been happening since literally the 1st century AD.
And don't forget, there's just as many of these types of schisms in the Catholic Church. We know about the Palmarians, there's the Union of Scranton, the Union of Utrecht, of course, lest we forget all the Protestant sects, which are also technically schisms off of the Catholic Church, at least any kind of confessional one that dates back to the Reformation. But at the same time, there is still, even the Sedevacantists and even SSPX type groups have schisms on schisms on schisms. So lest any Catholics say, oh, this is because of the national nature of Orthodox ecclesiology, blah, 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 blah. Let's not go there. But in some of that vein, we're going to talk, we're taking a question from Luke here, who asks, I continue to struggle with the question, who is an American? Who is America? This question is essential for me to answer as it determines my loyalty. Who are my people? If a fight is to occur, I must know whose team I'm going to be on. I'm expecting a fight of our lifetime. Metropolitan Neophytos answered Conrad that we must act according to our faith. According to my faith, I'm loyal to my nation. Who is my nation? Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this Q&A. If you want to ask a question to be featured in the next one, and we do answer basically all of the questions. None were left this time. All the way to the end, we answer some great ones about American identity, about South Africa, about some prophecies regarding some other things. So be sure to get behind the paywall. But if you want to do that, just get behind that paywall and support the show. It supports keeping the weekly World War Now episodes free as well. So you're not just supporting us, but you get access to all the Aether Hours and the ability to ask us these questions. So I think think it's well worth it. And of course, like we said, it keeps the show available and up and running. So thank you so much for your support, and God bless.